Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Michael Bloomberg, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Tom Steyer squared off at the 10th Democratic debate in South Carolina. The event was the last debate prior to the South Carolina primary, in which Joe Biden scored his first victory of the 2020 Democratic primary.
And my buddy Jim Clyburn, you brought me back!
Congratulations, by the way, to Mr. Biden and his campaign.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, South Carolina!
No doubt that victory was all but secured before he even stepped foot on stage, but more crucial to this debate was the next phase in the Democratic primary contest, Super Tuesday. On March 3rd, a full third of the Democratic delegates will be assigned. In this video, I'll break down the South Carolina debate performances of each of the participating candidates. While the debate was a somewhat chaotic event, and evaluating the candidates' performances felt a little bit trickier and more up for interpretation than last time around, I'll still do my best to rank them from best to worst. At the very least, I'll try to explain who looks like a loser of this debate and who looks like a winner. Let's begin with Joe Biden, who I took to be the clearest winner of the South Carolina debate. In the Nevada debate, Joe Biden had more energy and charisma than he had demonstrated in prior debates, and he kept that momentum going in South Carolina. He had no shortage of forceful, passionate speeches, and his confidence was obvious throughout the event. While Biden may no longer be the nationwide frontrunner, he managed to retain the lead in the polls in South Carolina, and days before the state took to the polls, he was able to declare firmly that he would win the primary. But he also demonstrated humility, claiming that he intended to earn those votes.
I don't expect anything. I plan to earn the vote. I'm here to ask. I'm here to earn it. But folks, I intend to win South Carolina, and I will win the African-American vote here in South Carolina.
Mr. Biden, will you continue if you do not win South Carolina? You have said that South Carolina will determine the outcome of this presidential race. If you don't win South Carolina, will you continue in this race?
I will win South Carolina.
Probably the most distinct thing about the 10th Democratic debate was how disruptive and chaotic the event was. Candidates were frequently speaking on top of one another and over their allotted times, and moderators recurrently failed to keep control. While I think a number of candidates could potentially be harmed as a result of this lack of decorum, Biden seemed to make the most of it, frequently pointing to his own refusal to perpetuate the rudeness and rowdiness.
Whoa.
Vice President Biden, please.
I guess the only way you do this is jump in and speak twice as long as you should. Here's the deal.
Normally, being a stickler for the rules might be seen as uptight, but this event really was almost unwatchable. Being the champion of the debate rules made Biden an ally of really everyone trying to watch. As a consummate critic of Medicare for All, a potential weakness of Joe Biden, as his opponents argue, is that his healthcare plan of a public option doesn't go far enough. Biden worked to counter this narrative by highlighting another way in which he would work to improve healthcare, by investing in medical research.
We're going to focus at least $50 billion over the first 5 years on focusing on obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and cancer. And we're going to make that investment because no one else is willing to make that investment. We can, in fact, find cures if we make the investment. And we can get that done. The American people support it. Even Republicans will support it. We have to focus on extending life, saving life, and making people, put them in a position to be able to live longer and more securely.
Leading up to Super Tuesday, Biden needed to take aim at the frontrunner of the race, Bernie Sanders. And relying on a victory in South Carolina to help his own standing prior to the critical March 3rd contest, he needed to play to his own support with black voters. Biden did both at the same time with two attacks on Bernie Sanders. One effective, one a little weaker.
Walking distance here is Mother Emanuel Church. 9 people shot dead by a white supremacist. Bernie voted 5 times against the Brady bill and wanted a waiting period. No, let me finish. And waited, a waiting period of 12 hours. I'm not saying he's responsible for the 9 deaths, but that man would not have been able to get that weapon with the waiting period had been what I suggest until you are cleared. In addition to that, being progressive, he thought Barack Obama, he wanted a primary. He say we should primary Barack Obama. Someone should. And in fact, the president was weak, and our administration was, in fact, not up to it. Look, folks, let's talk about progressive. Progressive is getting things done, and that's what we got done.
Now, the second argument that Biden makes, that Sanders argued in favor of potentially primarying Obama, could frustrate black voters, but the idea that this was not a progressive move is actually nonsense. Sanders, of course, considered the idea because he thought Obama wasn't progressive enough. Now, the first attack was far more legitimate. He sensibly didn't attempt to put the tragedy squarely on Sanders' shoulders, but pointing out Bernie's weaknesses in this area was a legitimate criticism in my view. Connecting it to Charleston should also make the critique play more effectively, especially for the black community. All in all, Biden's performance was very strong in this debate. He showed passion and energy, he attacked his biggest Super Tuesday rival, and he managed to escape the evening without taking damage. Other candidates didn't really go after him, and unlike in several past debates, he didn't dunk on himself. It was a clear win for the Biden team. As the frontrunner of the race, Senator Bernie Sanders received the opening question of the debate, one about Trump's economy. His response was a strong one, which essentially boiled down to pointing out the economic woes of working people.
The economy is doing really great for people like Mr. Bloomberg and other billionaires. In the last 3 years, billionaires in this country saw an $850 billion increase in their wealth. But you know what? For the ordinary American, things are not so good. Last year, real wage increases for the average worker were less than 1%. Half of our people are living paycheck to paycheck. 87 million Americans have no health insurance or are underinsured. 45 million people are struggling with student debt. 500,000 people tonight are sleeping out on the street, including 30,000 veterans. That is not an economy that's working for the American people. That's an economy working for the 1%. We're going to create an economy for all, not just wealthy campaign contributors.
Sanders was then attacked by Michael Bloomberg.
Vladimir Putin thinks that Donald Trump should be president of the United States, and that's why Russia is helping you get elected, so you'll lose to him.
Here's how Sanders responded.
Let me tell Mr. Putin, okay, I'm not a good friend of President Xi of China. I think President Xi is an authoritarian leader. And let me tell Mr. Putin, who interfered in the 2016 election, try to bring Americans against Americans. Hey, Mr. Putin, if I'm president of the United States, trust me, you're not going to interfere in any more American elections.
Senator Warren?
This was a reasonably good response, but missed something very important. Bloomberg's argument that Trump and Russia prefer Sanders as the Democratic candidate is essentially an electability argument. The point is that the enemies of the Democratic Party want Sanders to win the nomination because it makes it easier for Donald Trump to get reelected. Whether or not this argument has rhetorical force is a matter of opinion. But whether or not it is true is easily checkable through polling. For Bloomberg to have merit with this argument, he needs to be clearly more electable than Bernie Sanders. But is he? Well, according to the polls, he does have a case to make. It just isn't a very good one. In the traditional swing state of Florida, the most recent poll from University of North Florida shows Bloomberg to be the most electable in the Democratic field, with plus 6 points over Donald Trump, while other major candidates Klobuchar and Buttigieg are losing. Here, Biden, Sanders, and Warren are essentially tied with the president. Florida would be an incredibly valuable state for Democrats to lock down. But this is just one poll from a pollster that 538 gives a A/B grade to, which is pretty good but not great. In a number of other states, Bernie is actually the most electable candidate in the field. Emerson found Sanders to lead the field in Colorado, tied with Biden for plus 10 points over Trump. An A-rated Survey USA poll back in November found Sanders to again essentially tie Biden as the most electable in Georgia, with plus 3 and plus 4 respectively over Trump. In Michigan, the latest poll by YouGov has Sanders and Buttigieg leading the field, with plus 7 and plus 6 over Trump. Likewise, in Nevada, Sanders and Buttigieg lead the field with plus 11 points over Trump, far ahead of the other candidates. In New Mexico, Sanders leads everyone by significant margins with plus 18 over Trump. In North Carolina, Sanders and Bloomberg have a statistical tied lead over Trump with plus 5 and plus 6 respectively. In Pennsylvania, there's a clear difference, with Sanders beating Trump by 3 points and Bloomberg losing to Trump by 3. In Texas, Sanders seems to have the best chance of flipping the state blue, with just +2 points for Trump compared to +5 for Trump versus Bloomberg. In Virginia, Sanders leads with +9 over Trump compared to just +6 for Bloomberg, the lowest result amongst all the major Democrats. In Wisconsin, once again, Sanders leads the field with +2 over Trump, whereas Bloomberg fares second to last among the major candidates, losing to Trump by 1 point. Nationwide, RCP gives Sanders a spread of +4.7 points over Trump, a virtual tie of the +4.8 points over Trump that Biden has. As for Bloomberg, the average result is lower, +4.0 over Trump. That's better than Warren, Buttigieg, and Klobuchar, but it's certainly not better than Sanders. None of the last 7 head-to-head polls show Sanders losing the popular vote to Donald Trump. 2 of them show Trump beating Bloomberg. So all in all, Bloomberg is not totally unelectable. In a couple of critical states, he's among the best choices. But the idea that Sanders is less electable is not supported by the evidence. He's more electable than Bloomberg in a number of critical states, and in most cases leads the field. Nationwide, polls show that he has more support versus Trump than does Bloomberg. Sanders, and Biden too, by the way, appear to be the 2 candidates who are clearly more electable than Bloomberg. Point being, if you want to make an argument about electability, it helps if you're more electable than the candidate you're attacking. Sanders faltered in that he responded to the Russia part of the attack, but did not point out his own electability. He did recover, however, from this error by pointing to the head-to-head polling a little later in the debate.
The other hand, of the last 50 polls that have been done nationally, Mr. Bloomberg, I beat Trump 47 of those 50 times. If you look at battleground states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, polling just
the
done
polls
this
aren't
Sunday,
the election.
I beat Trump. And if you want to beat Trump, what you're going to need is an unprecedented grassroots movement of black and white and Latino, Native American and Asian people who are standing up and fighting for justice.
Can anybody
That's what our movement is about.
Following Bloomberg's attacks about Russia, at the top of the debate, Bernie was then attacked by Elizabeth Warren, then Pete Buttigieg, then Tom Steyer, and then Joe Biden before he was given a chance to respond. Not 20 seconds into his response, he was already getting interrupted by Pete Buttigieg.
I'm hearing my name mentioned a little bit tonight. I wonder why. And maybe, Pete mentions what the American people want. I will tell you, Pete, what the American people want, and Joe, what the American people want. They don't want candidates to be running to billionaaires for huge amounts of funding.
All right, let's clear this up once and for all.
Pete has gotten funding
you've got people
from
believing
over
something
50
that is false.
billionaires.
This
Joe,
needs
I
to be
think, has
cleared
gotten
up.
a little bit more. What the
All right.
American people want, by the way, and a lot of the issues we'll be discussing tonight are issues I raised 4 years ago. Raising the minimum wage to a living wage, $15 an hour, making public colleges and universities tuition free, and finally doing what every other major country on earth does, guaranteeing health care to all people as a human right through a Medicare for all single-payer system.
This was a pattern that repeated itself throughout much of the debate. While every other candidate was given a chance to respond when they were attacked, several times Sanders was attacked without being given a chance to respond. Or when he was, he would get interrupted, most often by Pete Buttigieg. This cuts both ways for Sanders. Not getting a chance to respond to the attacks allowed the attacks to sit, so undecided voters and supporters of other candidates likely became increasingly unlikely to support Sanders. On the other hand, the fact that moderators seemed to tilt the tables against Sanders here probably worked to mobilize and intensify his existing base of support, as many of his supporters are already suspicious of mainstream media and establishment bias against Sanders. Were Sanders struggling to lead the Democratic field, this would essentially add up to a downside for his debate performance. But as the frontrunner, it might actually amount to a net positive. While Sanders, of course, already has very dedicated supporters, one area where he probably generally struggles with is appealing to voters who aren't particularly interested in a political revolution. More pragmatic voters who think that Sanders is an all-or-nothing guy who can't make progress in small steps. In this debate, Sanders actually did a reasonable job of highlighting some of his less-than-radical proposals and lesser-known legislation he's created.
Very proud working with Congressman Jim Clyburn, South Carolina. that we increased funding for the Community Health Center program by $11 billion as part of the Affordable Care Act, which now provides for 9 million Americans access to primary health care, dental care, mental health counseling, and low-cost prescription drugs. In that bill, we also put $2 billion into a program which would provide debt forgiveness for doctors, nurses, dentists. We have a major dental affordable crisis in this country, to make sure that they are practicing in underserved areas. We are going to triple funding for low-income Title I schools, because kids' education should not depend upon the zip code in which they live. And we're going to move to make certain that no teacher in America earns less than $60,000 a year. We want great teachers. We will change the Federal Controlled Substance Act, which, if you can believe it, now equates heroin with marijuana. That's insane. We're going to take marijuana out of that and effectively legalize marijuana in every state in the country. What we are also going to do is move to expunge the records of those people who are arrested for possession of marijuana. And I'll tell you what else we're going to do. We're going to provide help to the African American, Latino, Native American community to start businesses to sell legal marijuana, rather than let a few corporations control the legalized marijuana market.
Sanders did, however, take some damage in some areas, even when he was given a chance to respond to attacks. For example, he was asked how he would pay for his policy proposals, like Medicare for All.
Yesterday, you released information about how you will pay for your major proposals, but not all of your details are clear. You've proposed more than $50 trillion in new spending. You've said Medicare for All will cost $30 trillion. But you can only explain how you'll pay for just about half of that. Can you do the math for the rest of us?
How many hours do you have?
The glib response of how many hours you have makes it seem like Sanders has something to hide when it comes to paying for his programs. His website lays out ways to pay for many of his proposals, but there are still holes. When it comes to Medicare for All in particular, this program actually is accounted for in his revenue proposal. Citing figures from CMS.org, his campaign projects spending under the current system to be $30 trillion, and the total cost of Medicare for All to be $47 trillion, based on the recent article published in Lancet. Bernie's campaign comes up with a menu of new revenue sources amounting to $17.5 trillion, more than the difference of the current spending and Medicare for All's total 10-year price tag, which means if paired with these new taxes, his proposal would be deficit neutral. While Bernie touches on some of this in his responses, he doesn't really put together the full picture.
That's the problem.
No, it's not the problem. All right, let's talk about Medicare for All. I'm sure you're familiar with a new study that just came out of Yale University, published in Lancet magazine, one of the prestigious medical journals in the world. You know what it said? Medicare for All will lower healthcare costs in this country by $450 billion a year and save 68,000 lives of people who otherwise would have died. What we need to do is to do what every other major country on earth does, guarantee health care to all people, not have thousands of separate insurance plans which are costing us some $500 billion a year to administer. Our plan, we have laid out options all over the place. One of the options is a 7.5% payroll tax on employers, which will save them substantial sums of money.
Bernie, let me respond to this.
What the Health and Human Services have said in analyzing healthcare costs, what recent Yale study has said is that your program would cost some $50 trillion over a 10-year period. We would continue to pay, in some cases, 10 times more for the same exact prescription drugs. What every study out there, conservative or progressive, says, Medicare for All will save money. Ours will cost about $45 billion, not $60 trillion.
No, I was talking.
Probably would have helped if he wasn't getting interrupted by other candidates, but Bernie really didn't string it all together here as well as his website does. If I hadn't read his website, I'd probably think he has not accounted for how to pay for Medicare for all. Another weakness in Sanders' debate performance was the fact that an area of weakness in his record was brought up.
You've gone after the insurance industry, you've taken on pharmaceutical companies, and you've taken on big tech. Why did you vote repeatedly to give gun manufacturers a pass?
As I've said a number of times, this is an area where Sanders' record is mixed. While I don't think it's a significant enough issue to bring down his campaign, it clearly damages his progressive image. Here's Sanders' response.
I have cast thousands of votes, including bad votes. That was a bad vote. I have today a D- voting record from the NRA. 30 years ago, I likely lost a race for the one seat for Congress in Vermont because 30 years ago I supported a ban on assault weapons. 30 years ago. Right now, my view is we need to expand background checks, end the gun show loophole, and do what the American people want, not what the NRA
wait
wants.
a second.
30 years ago, supported a ban on assault weapons. Mike Bloomberg has started a very good organization, Moms Demand Action. Congratulations. They have credited me with gun sense, as you know.
Yes, we did.
Furthermore.
So Sanders does some work here to mitigate the damage, but all that really does is soften the blow. This stuff certainly doesn't help with Democrats, especially not the left wing of the party, which is his base. Finally, let's talk about another major issue raised for Bernie Sanders in this debate. Here, I think the criticism Sanders is facing is, well, stupid.
Can Americans trust that a Democratic Socialist president will not give authoritarians a free pass?
I have opposed authoritarianism all over the world. You got a real dictatorship there? Of course you have a dictatorship in Cuba. What I said is what Barack Obama said in terms of Cuba, that Cuba made progress on education. Yes, I think, really? Really?
Yes, because there's no comparing those two
What Barack Obama said is they made great progress on education and health care. That was Barack Obama.
I talked to Barack Obama.
Excuse me. Occasionally, it might be a good idea to be honest about American foreign policy. And that includes the fact that America has overthrown governments all over the world, in Chile, in Guatemala, in Iran. And when dictatorships, whether it is the Chinese or the Cubans, do something good, you acknowledge that. But you don't have trade love letters with them.
Barack Obama was abroad. He was in a town meeting. He did not in any way suggest that there was anything positive about the Cuban government. He acknowledged that they did increase life expectancy, but he went on and condemned the dictatorship. He went on and condemned the people who, in fact, had run that committee. He also made sure to make it clear, and by the way, I called to make sure that I was prepared to, I never say in my private conversation with him, but the fact of the matter is, he, in fact, did not, has never embraced an authoritarian regime and does not now. Okay. This man said that, in fact, he did not condemn what they did.
That is untrue, categorically untrue.
What did you tell him?
I have condemned authoritarianism, whether it is the people in Saudi Arabia that the United States government has
Cuba,
loved
Nicaragua?
For years. Cuba, Nicaragua. Authoritarianism of any stripe is bad. But that is different than saying that governments occasionally do things that are good.
Look,
that's what Barack Obama said.
Margaret, the only way we're going to restore American credibility.
This is honestly just a dumb conversation to be having. Castro was a dictator, who, by the way, replaced a US-backed dictator, Batista. Castro did a lot of terrible things, not least of which was creating a one-party communist state, arresting tens of thousands of people for being counter-revolutionaries, persecuting gays, mismanaging the Cuban economy, and greatly endangering the safety of the island by provoking the United States. Castro also did a lot of good things in terms of healthcare and education, drastically raising literacy rates and providing medicine not only to the poor people in Cuba, but also exporting doctors all over the developing world. By 2007, Cuba was providing more medical personnel to the developing world than all the G8 countries combined. It would be nice to think that Democratic voters were wise enough to realize that the world isn't just made up of bad guys and good guys, and that having a slightly more nuanced perspective on foreign policy was also politically expedient. But I'm not 100% sure that that is the case. It is likely that saying positive things, even totally true positive things, about Fidel Castro will be a liability for Sanders, especially in Florida, with its large population of Cuban expats who fled the island to escape Castro's regime. This, of course, doesn't much chip away at Bernie Sanders' standing in Super Tuesday, however, as Florida does not vote until March 17th, nor does it affect the primary race overall, as Biden and Bloomberg were already ahead in that state. Overall, Sanders had low points in this debate, as well as a number of strong moments. The mixed performance will probably not have a strong impact on the polls either way. As the frontrunner in the race, that's good enough to be considered a win. It's probably not as effective a debate as Biden had, but a second-place finish nonetheless. Sanders wasn't the only candidate to have a mixed performance in South Carolina. Warren, Klobuchar, Steyer, and Buttigieg all had high and low points. In fact, the four were so even in their overall performances that it's probably reasonable to call it a four-way tie for third place. But for better and for worse, the most interesting performance of the lot came from Mayor Pete. Pete had plenty of positives in his debate performance. Perhaps his strongest moment was a short speech about the standing of America in the world, in which he tied in a reference to his own military experience.
One of the things that kept me safe, just as sure as my body armor, was the fact that the flag on my shoulder represented a country that was known to keep its word. Our allies and our adversaries knew it. The president has torn that to shreds. And so the first thing we've got to do is restore the credibility of the United States.
Pete also did some work to counter the idea, pushed by his progressive rivals, that his campaign is bought by billionaires.
The idea that most of my campaign is funded by billionaires?
I didn't say that, Pete.
50 people. All right. In Charleston alone, just in Charleston, over 2,000 people have contributed to my campaign. That means the dollars that have come to my campaign just from Charleston is more than the dollars that have come from the 50 people that you mentioned. Grassroots contributions are the lifeblood of my campaign. In fact, I shouldn't miss the opportunity. If you're watching right now and you support my campaign, go to PeteForAmerica.com and chip in. And if you're watching right now and you're a billionaire, I will raise your taxes. But if you'd like to defeat Donald Trump, please go to PeteForAmerica.com and donate the legal maximum of $2,800.
Key to the effectiveness of that speech is that Pete points out that he plans on raising the taxes of billionaires. Sure, he still gets their support, and sure, his plans don't go anywhere near the wealth taxes proposed by Sanders or Warren, but emphasizing that he's planning on raising their taxes does do some work to repair his image as a puppet of wealthy donors. Now, this being a debate in South Carolina, Pete also made a strong plea to black voters.
When I was born, there was no difference in your life expectancy if you were born in a rural area or a city. Now the gap is the biggest it's been in a generation, and that is particularly affecting black rural families in places like South Carolina. We're seeing hospital closures right and left, and we're seeing them in particular in states where Medicaid was not expanded, something that is hurting black and poor white families and is largely the result of racial voter suppression. See, all of these things are connected: housing, wages, the ability to get anything meaningful done on criminal justice reform. All of these things are going to be harder to deal with as long as black voices are systematically excluded from political participation, which is happening on everything from the purging of voter rolls to the closing of voting locations. And that harms everybody.
Time,
it's why in my Frederick Douglass plan for comprehensively dealing with these issues, part of the core of it is a 21st century voting rights act.
Pete again made an argument designed to pull in black voters, a demographic he currently struggles with, in his criticisms for Michael Bloomberg.
Do you think the New York City's implementation of stop and frisk was racist?
Yes, in effect it was, because it was about profiling people based on their race. And the mayor even said that they disproportionately stopped white people too often and minorities too little. And I'm not here to score points. I come at this with a great deal of humility because we have had a lot of issues, especially when it comes to racial justice and policing in my own community.
That point in particular, where he cops to the problems he himself has had in dealing with racial issues in his own city, should work toward healing his own relationship with the black community. It's hard to win over voters of a group when you can't fess up to your own past mistakes.
And I come to this with some humility because I'm conscious of the fact that there's 7 white people on this stage talking about racial justice. None of us have the experience, the lived experience of, for example, walking down the street or in a mall and feeling eyes on us, regarding us as dangerous without knowing the first thing about us just because of the color of our skin.
I think this answer does show some humility and empathy. And while it in some ways can be seen as an attack on Bloomberg, it is, in a larger sense, Pete humbling himself before black voters. This, I think, might open more black voters up to considering Pete as a potential candidate, although, of course, it's likely too little too late. But credit where credit is due, it's a step in the right direction. Pete was also wise to focus the majority of his attacks on the frontrunner of the primary race, Bernie Sanders. Here he is making an argument about divisiveness, sure to score him points among suburbanites, moderates, and older voters.
And I am not looking forward to a scenario where it comes down to Donald Trump with his nostalgia for the social order of the 1950s and Bernie Sanders with a nostalgia for the revolutionary politics of the 1960s. Look, if you think the last 4 years has been chaotic, divisive, toxic, exhausting, imagine spending the better part of 2020 with Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump. Think about what that will be like for this country. Also, there's a majority of the American people who I think right now just want to be able to turn on the TV, see their president, and actually feel their blood pressure go down a little bit instead of up through the roof.
A somewhat less effective argument coming from Buttigieg was over the issue of electability.
I'll tell you exactly what it adds up to. It adds up to 4 more years of Donald Trump, Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House, and the inability to get the Senate into Democratic hands. The time has come for us to stop acting like the presidency is the only office that matters. Not only is this a way to get Donald Trump reelected, we got a House to worry about.
Now, when it comes to the coattail effect, Pete may very well have a point that an extremely progressive candidate will be less effective in helping congressional Democrats win in purple districts and states. Truth be told, we don't actually know that for sure, since there has not really been an extremely progressive Democratic president since FDR. But when it comes to actually beating Donald Trump, as I mentioned in the Bernie Sanders section of this video, Pete has absolutely no case to make. Polling shows nationwide, and in state after state, Sanders is far more electable than Pete Buttigieg. He's probably the most electable candidate in the field, seriously rivaled only by Joe Biden. Now, the general effort of Pete's to go after Sanders aggressively was a strong debate strategy, one that might very well improve his standing among moderate Democrats who feel that Sanders is too radical. But one tactic Pete employed pursuant this strategy was, in my view, extremely counterproductive.
And I challenge everyone. Senator Klobuchar, next question. New topic. Senator
I don't know where you got the impression.
If you could.
Do we think health care for all, Pete, is some kind of radical communist idea? Do we think raising the minimum wage to a living wage? Do we think building the millions?
Mr. Steyer,
I think we're talking about
that. We'll get to you, Mr. Sanders.
Let's talk about it.
Can I say something?
Look, first of all,
if you're going to ask that rhetorical question, let's
raising
go behind the
taxes
filters.
on billionaires is a radical idea?
Let's talk about what's radical about that plan. I think we were talking about math, and it doesn't take 2 hours to do the math. Because let's talk about what it adds up to.
We don't.
Let's talk about math indeed. Okay, so here's the math. No, here's the math.
In virtually every poll that has done, and why I will defeat them.
We got to open this up. Universal health care, for example.
Senator Klobuchar.
Pete constantly interrupted Sanders and other candidates when it was not his turn to talk. This debate was incredibly frustrating to watch because of how much candidates were talking over one another. The moderators have caught plenty of heat for not being able to control the debate. But I think if you're running for president, you should also be accountable for your actions. And while there was generally a lot of crosstalk in this debate, no one was even close to as consistently disruptive as Pete Buttigieg. I personally found it to be completely obnoxious, and I think plenty of debate viewers felt the same way. The lack of decorum somewhat undermines his arguments about civility and divisiveness. I could certainly see older, undecided voters to lean more toward Biden, who demonstrated more personal discipline throughout the event. On the whole, Pete's disruptive behavior was not enough to make the debate a total loser for him, as he had plenty of positive moments to counteract the negative effects. But with his Iowa and New Hampshire bumps fading into the past, Pete's mixed performance was probably not sufficient to count as a win. Polling does not suggest he'll be a serious contender on Super Tuesday, and I don't expect this debate performance to change anything. Elizabeth Warren's performance at the South Carolina debate was most noteworthy for being utterly unremarkable. While in the Nevada debate, she dominated the debate stage, she faded into the background this time around. While Warren suffered no real damage lobbed by other candidates, she didn't make her presence felt either. With her diminishing standing in the nationwide polls, she could not afford to have a less than stellar performance at this debate, and unfortunately for her, that's exactly what she had. Warren's most interesting moments came in the form of attacks on other candidates, particularly Bernie Sanders and Michael Bloomberg. She pressed Bloomberg on his and his company's treatment of women, which I'll talk about during the Bloomberg section of this video. She also attacked the former New York City mayor on his funding of Republican senators.
Who funded Lindsey Graham's campaign for re-election last time? It was Mayor Bloomberg. And that's not the only right-wing senator that Mayor Bloomberg has funded. In 2016, he dumped $12 million into the Pennsylvania Senate race to help re-elect an anti-choice right-wing Republican senator. And I just want to say, the woman challenger was terrific. She lost by a single point. In 2012, he scooped in to try to defend another Republican senator against a woman challenger. That was me. It didn't work, but he tried hard.
Not that this wasn't a strong moment for Warren, but it did far more to damage Bloomberg than it did to propel her campaign forward. She actually had a more sophisticated attack against Sanders, where she combined attacks of Bernie with advocacy for her own campaign.
The way I see this is that Bernie is winning right now because the Democratic Party is a progressive party, and progressive ideas are popular ideas, even if there are a lot of people on this stage who don't want to say so. But Bernie and I agree on a lot of things, but I think I would make a better president than Bernie. And the reason for that is that getting a progressive agenda enacted is going to be really hard, and it's going to take someone who digs into the details to make it happen.
This point about digging into the details is an effective attack. It highlights the brand she's created for herself as a policy wonk, with the slogan, "I've got a plan for that." Simultaneously, it piles on the critique of Bernie Sanders that his plans to pay for his plans are insufficient.
Bernie and I both wanted to help rein in Wall Street. In 2008, we both got our chance. But I dug in, I fought the big banks, I built the coalitions, and I won.
This again plays to Warren's strengths, a reference to her work in creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Bernie and I both want to see universal health care, but Bernie's plan doesn't explain how to get there, doesn't show how we're going to get enough allies into it, and doesn't show enough about how we're going to pay for it.
Again, this is probably a pretty effective attack, as Bernie's constantly criticized along the lines of paying for Medicare for all. Warren's proposal for paying for Medicare for all is arguably quite a bit more lofty than the plan Sanders has. While Sanders' plan includes a payroll tax, similar to how single-payer healthcare is paid for in most countries, Warren's ambition was to pay for healthcare without raising taxes on the middle class. The largest new tax, valued at $9 trillion in new revenue, is from employers, expecting that they pay the government essentially the same amount that they currently spend on private healthcare plans. That's certainly an interesting idea, and there's good reason to suspect it would work. After all, corporations are already forced to spend that money anyway to maintain the status quo. But her plan also requires the redirection of the funding currently allocated to the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund, the taxation of new immigrants as a result of passing comprehensive immigration reform, and a massive increase in IRS enforcement to gain $2.3 trillion in new taxes. Another $2.9 trillion is expected to come from managing to tax corporations on foreign earnings. Now, I love all of these ideas, but they're lofty goals, not easy to pass plans. It's hard to snap your fingers and close a piece of the military, pass comprehensive immigration reform, improve the competence of the IRS, and get corporations to give up their tax havens. Sanders' list of new tax streams include far more practical measures, like raising the top federal corporate income tax rate, taxing capital gains, and capping the state and local tax deduction for married couples. Sanders may be the one calling for a political revolution, but it's Warren's plan to raise revenue for healthcare that sounds a lot more like starry-eyed idealism.
I dug in, I did the work, and then Bernie's team trashed me for it. We need a president who is going to dig in, do the hard work, and actually get it done. Progressives have got one shot, and we need to spend it with a leader who will get something done.
Okay, so ending that way was also not great. Whether or not you believe that the anonymously posted talking points that included an argument against Warren's electability were actually from the Sanders campaign, and whether or not you believe that calling her supporters more reliable Democratic voters is some kind of insult, Warren's complaints about this issue, added with her claims that Sanders told her in a secret one-on-one meeting that, contrary to everything he said publicly throughout his entire career, he in fact does not think a woman could win the presidency, going toe-to-toe with Bernie on these issues was the last stand she made for her campaign several weeks ago. Soon after, she dropped in the polls as he surged. Possibly this confrontation caused this. What's certain is that it did not prevent this from happening. On a more personal note, I think that complaining that Sanders supporters are trashing her campaign is not just politically inexpedient, it also casts her in a pretty negative light. In my view, they should be criticizing her and her campaign, just as her supporters should be criticizing Sanders and his campaign. That's ideally how democracy works. Voters discuss what they do and don't like about candidates in order to inform their choices of who to support. Factors including experience, ideology, and yes, electability should be top of mind. I have friends who prefer Warren, and they've told me things like they prefer a female candidate, or they think Warren is more practical, or they think she'd be more unifying for the Democratic Party, or even that they just like her more. These are fair arguments to make. And as a Sanders supporter myself, I would hope that Bernie wouldn't whine about it on national television if he heard such things being espoused. Klobuchar began the debate, like almost all other candidates on stage, with a criticism of Bernie Sanders. But hers was particularly problematic, as it was both unoriginal and untrue.
Does the math add up?
No, the math does not add up. In fact, just on 60 Minutes this weekend, he said he wasn't going to rattle through the nickels and the dimes. Well, let me tell you how many nickels and dimes we're talking about. Nearly $60 trillion. Do you know how much that is for all of his programs? That is 3 times the American economy, not the federal government, the entire American economy.
So this argument borrows quite a bit from a line Buttigieg spouted out during the Nevada debate. He claimed that the budget hole in Bernie Sanders' plan is bigger than the size of the entire economy of the United States. I feel like I let Pete off the hook a little too much for this. I think I said it was deceptive but didn't really expound too much on why. But it is incredibly misleading, if not a total lie. It is so false and destructive to the value of truth that PolitiFact rated it as half true. Why? Well, first let's just use our common sense. Do you really think that Bernie Sanders' plans, as socialist and idealistic and divorced from reality as moderates might take them to be, could actually cost as much as the entire US economy, let alone cause a budget hole of unexplained costs to be larger than the entire US economy? I don't care how lofty you think free college, universal healthcare, and free childcare are, European countries do these things all the time, and many of them are prospering economically. So what's the problem with their math? Well, they're accurately describing the size of the US economy, roughly $21.4 trillion in 2019. But then they're comparing this figure to plans that include 10 years of spending. Whether it's Bernie's healthcare plans or his whole platform, the costs associated that are often talked about are always accounting for 10 years. Now, when it comes to these costs, Amy and Pete both chose the higher estimates, which tend to exaggerate the issue, but I have no serious problem with this. Everyone picks the numbers that are politically convenient when multiple projections are available. But if you want to compare 10 years of Bernie policy costs to the US economy, you have to look at 10 years of GDP, not one. The latest CBO estimate amounts to around $300 trillion of GDP by 2030. So what Pete said was more than the size of the entire US economy was actually just 8% of the US economy. And what Amy described as 3 times the entire economy was actually, at best, 20% of the economy.
The Medicare for All plan alone, page 8, clearly says that it'll kick 149 million Americans off their current health insurance in 4 years. That is true.
That's also deceptive. The claim gives the impression that Sanders' plan would leave people without health insurance, when in fact it does the opposite. Sanders and Warren, in fact, have the only plans that guarantee universal coverage. Sanders' plan would only kick people off their current plans insofar as they would force them to switch over to a government plan, which in the vast majority of cases means more healthcare coverage for a lower price tag.
As one prominent Democrat once said, we should pay attention to where the voters of this country are, Bernie. That prominent Democrat was Barack Obama a few months ago, and I think that's what we should do. They are not with you on spending nearly $60 trillion. What I think we should do is make things more affordable, nonprofit public option, make sure we're paying for long-term care better, take on the pharmaceuticals like you and I have done together, and do something for the people of America instead of a bunch of broken promises that sound good on bumper stickers.
Mr. Steyer.
Once Klobuchar stopped trying to make somewhat deceptive arguments about healthcare and got down to the nitty-gritty, I think she actually had great things to say.
People aren't always aware, I know you are in South Carolina, about how much poverty there is, particularly child poverty in rural areas. So the answer is one size doesn't fit all. And one of the ways you do this, right now we have something called critical access hospitals. So they're designated for rural areas. And actually I am the lead Democrat on a bill to extend that, to have other types of hospitals like emergency rooms in rural areas be covered. The other issue is we don't have enough personnel. And so that's where we get to this education plan. And I don't agree with some of my colleagues here about putting hard-earned taxpayer money into rich kids going to college. What I think we need to do instead is look at what our needs are in our economy. We're going to have 1 million openings for home health care workers, particularly in rural areas that we don't know how to fill. We're going to have over 100,000 openings for nursing assistants. We're not going to have a shortage of sports marketing degrees. We're going to have a shortage of plumbers and nurses. So putting incentives in place with how we do loan payback, making 1- and 2-year degrees free, and then, of course, creating loan payback programs if people will go, especially medical students, into rural areas.
My only issue with this is the description of college for all as paying for rich kids to go to school. I mean, free public college under a universal system just means extending what we already do with public elementary, middle, and high schools to colleges. You can agree or disagree with this policy, but there's a reasonable argument to make that in the 21st century, a college education is kind of like what a high school education was when public high schools became a thing. So you can easily argue that this is just a natural extension of principles we're already living. Describing it as paying for rich kids to go to school is a little much. It's about everyone chipping in so everybody's kids get to go to school. Now, Amy also made pretty good arguments about her own abilities to get elected and to get things done. There was a little cherry picking here, but the arguments are fair enough to make.
And if you want to talk about getting things done and make a comparison, according to Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, last Congress, I was the most effective Democrat in the U.S. Senate on 15 metrics. Bernie and Elizabeth were in the bottom half. It matters. It matters if you can actually get things done. We've got to win in the middle of the country. And while everyone talks about winning rural areas, suburban areas, I'm the only one up here with the receipts that has actually repeatedly, while being for the assault weapon ban, won in Republican congressional districts over and over again, including Michelle Bachmann's district.
Really, the biggest problem for her electability argument is all the polls I showed you earlier in this video. Polls show Sanders and Biden to be the most electable, not Klobuchar. At any rate, here was what I thought was her best moment in the debate.
But I want to take this out of politics right now and talk to the American people because this is so serious. I'm not going to give my website right now. I'm going to give the CDC's website, which is cdc.gov, so that people keep checking in and they follow the rules and they realize what they have to do if they feel sick and they call their healthcare provider. Because many doctors are saying it's just a matter of time before we're going to start seeing this here.
Now, this is the Amy Klobuchar I love and would like to see more of. Deciding to take a moment to share the CDC's website rather than her own is a classy move and the right thing to do. It might be political posturing as it shows up Pete, who previously promoted his own page, but I'll take posturing if the posture is positive. Like several others, Amy Klobuchar had a mixed performance, and this simply isn't good enough when you're not doing well in the polls. Overall, it's a loss. Tom Steyer too had a mixed performance, but the mix leaned heavily towards bad. Steyer returned to the debate stage apparently after a revelation that, despite his frequent praise of Bernie Sanders in past debates, he's now extremely worried about the potentiality of Sanders securing the nomination. Steyer is not the first temporary Bernie ally to turn against him now that he's the frontrunner, but as I've already argued in this video, there are strong arguments against Sanders and weak arguments against Sanders. Then there's Steyer's approach. No argument at all.
Bernie Sanders' analysis is right. The difference is I don't like his solutions. I don't believe that a government takeover of large parts of the economy makes any sense for working people or for families.
Why? Why bother explaining? But no matter, Steyer did eventually come up with an argument against Bernie Sanders. See if you can place where he might have got this one from.
This conversation shows a huge risk for the Democratic Party. We are looking at a party that has decided that we're either going to support someone who's a democratic socialist or somebody who has a long history of being a Republican.
If you guessed Pete Buttigieg, you're correct. Pete made the exact argument multiple times in the Nevada debate. Steyer is essentially paraphrasing this argument about extremes from a guy who, in previous debates, Steyer criticized for a lack of experience and for not taking climate change seriously enough. Now let's see if you guys can guess who was making the following talking point prior to Steyer.
21st century warfare is cyber warfare. What we're having is an attack by a hostile foreign power on our democracy right now.
That's right. Also, Pete Buttigieg. Although to be fair, I think Yang also made arguments along these lines, so we would have accepted that answer as well. Okay, this next one isn't Pete Buttigieg, I promise.
I believe I'm the only person on this stage who believes in reparations for slavery. Something happened. We should have a formal commission on race to retell the story of the last 400 plus years in America of African Americans, of systematic legal injustice, discrimination, and cruelty, but also of 400 plus years of contribution in terms of building the United States of America and leading the United States of America from a moral standpoint.
Yes, Steyer's talked about reparations himself before, but his talking points come quite clearly from Marianne Williamson. Although to be fair, she put a specific number on her plan. So point being, Steyer borrowed a number of lines and policy ideas from other candidates. But I don't point these out just to point out how unoriginal he is. I honestly selected these clips because I thought they were the strongest things he had to say. It just so happens that all of his good stuff is borrowed. That's kind of a problem. On the upside for Steyer, however, he did do a reasonable job of blocking an attack issued by Joe Biden.
Well, my good friend on the end of this platform, he in fact bought a system that was a private prison system after he knew that, in fact, what happened was they hogtied young men in prison here in this state. They, in fact, made sure that in Georgia they did not have health care for the people who were being held. They, in fact, went on and he said, after he knew that, he bought it, and then he said he was proud of his accomplishment.
Mr. Mayor, you're allowed to respond.
I bought stock in a prison company thinking they'd do a better job, and I investigated and I sold it.
Okay.
You knew when you bought it they'd done that.
I get to answer this question. And in fact, since then, I've worked to end the use of private prisons in my home state, and we've ended it. I've started a bank to support black ownership of businesses, women ownership of businesses, and Latino owners of businesses, because this financial service industry is prejudiced. I have worked tirelessly on this, and you know I'm right. You wrote the crime bill.
Where we come from, that's called Tommy Come Lately.
There are other people here.
Put hundreds of thousands of young black and Latino
Not true.
men in prison.
Okay, so buying stock in a private prison is bad, but then he sold it and went on to fight until private prisons in his state were made illegal? I have long opposed private prisons, and I would take that deal, so I think he effectively deflected the damage. He also struck Biden back pretty hard with the reference to his support on tough-on-crime legislation. On balance, it was a pretty poor debate for Steyer, but he wasn't the worst performing candidate on stage. In fact, he wasn't even the worst performing billionaire. While sorting through who had a good debate and who had a bad one was particularly difficult for the 10th Democratic debate, it's pretty clear that Bloomberg was the biggest loser. Sure, he had an even worse debate last time around, but that isn't saying much. And even his joke about previous debate failure fell fairly flat.
But I really am surprised that all of these, my fellow contestants up here, I guess would be the right word for it, given nobody pays attention to the clock. I'm surprised they show up because I would have thought after I did such a good job in beating them last week that they'd be a little bit afraid to do that.
Candidates, Bloomberg. Candidates was the word you were looking for. This isn't a game show. The prize is the presidency, not a brand new car. Even while he was well aware that his last performance didn't cut it, and he reportedly spent a lot of effort in trying to turn it around for this debate, Bloomberg still didn't manage to get his act together, even when it came to issues that had already come up. On the issue of stop and frisk, Bloomberg's remarks on the subject were essentially a repeat of his inadequate responses in Nevada.
We let it get out of control. And when I realized that, I cut it back by 95%. And I've apologized and asked for forgiveness. I've met with black leaders to try to get an understanding of how I can better position myself and what I should have done and what I should do next time.
Bloomberg also didn't have adequate responses for the charges that his company created a hostile work environment for women. One of the big mistakes he had in Nevada surrounding this issue was trivializing the matter, saying that some women maybe didn't like a joke he told. Well, he made the same mistake again, referring to the entire matter as a sideshow.
And all of the sideshows that the senator wants to bring up have nothing to do with that. When people hired me to run New York City 3 times in an overwhelmingly Democratic progressive city, they elected me again and again.
Elizabeth Warren responded to this with her own story about pregnancy discrimination.
And referred to what I talk about as a sideshow. You know, this is personal for me. When I was 21 years old, I got my first job as a special education teacher. I loved that job. And by the end of the first year, I was visibly pregnant. The principal wished me luck and gave my job to someone else. Pregnancy discrimination, you bet. But I was 21 years old, I didn't have a union to protect me, and I didn't have any federal law on my side. So I packed up my stuff and I went home. At least I didn't have a boss who said to me, kill it, the way that Mayor Bloomberg
never
alleged
said
to
that.
have said to one of his pregnant employees.
Bloomberg denies ever saying this, but the words aren't pulled out of thin air. A sales representative from Bloomberg LP, Sakiko Sakai, alleged that he said that to her in a lawsuit filed in 1997. She also alleged that he repeated the order before muttering under his breath in frustration about the number of women who had become pregnant at the company. Bloomberg may now deny ever having said this, but his company settled with the plaintiff in 2000 for an undisclosed amount.
We went back 40 years and we could only find 3 cases where women said they were uncomfortable. Nobody accused me of doing anything other than just making a comment or two. And what the senator did suggest was that we release these women from the non-disclosure agreement. I did that 2 days later, and my company has said we will not use non-disclosure agreements ever again. The senator has got it, and I don't know what else she wants us to do.
Oh, I'll be clear.
We're following exactly what she asked to do.
I'll tell you exactly
and the
what I
trouble
want you to
is, with this senator, enough is never enough for what this. I'm going to start focusing on some of these other things. We just cannot continue to relitigate this every time. We did what she asked. And thank you. We've probably made the world better because of it. And by my company renouncing using these, we probably changed, hopefully, the corporate landscape all across America.
While Elizabeth Warren didn't get a chance to respond to this, the idea that he fully fulfilled her request is not particularly serious. His company announced that his company would not use non-disclosure agreements in the future and identified 3 women bound by NDAs who they would offer releases to. But it isn't clear how many others are still bound by such agreements, and Bloomberg has not said that he would release any and all women currently bound by such agreements, which is what Warren and Biden suggested he do during the Nevada debate. At any rate, any goodwill generated from the positive steps he's taken so far is somewhat rolled back by how much he congratulated himself here for taking those steps. Speaking of generating goodwill, Bloomberg attempted to do so by making very obvious claims, which he apparently saw as bold.
Oh, wait a second. I know that if I were black, my success would have been a lot harder to achieve. And I know a lot of black people that if they were white, it would have been a lot easier for them. That's just a fact, and we've got to do something about it than rather just demagogue about it.
Yeah, of course that's true. It does not make you a hero to say this. Bloomberg also tried to pander to black voters by pointing to endorsements from black officials.
I have over 100 black elected officials that have endorsed me. A lot of them are in the audience tonight.
When it comes to endorsements, of course, Biden has the most generally and the most endorsements from the Congressional Black Caucus. More importantly, the endorsements of public officials, while arguably important in many cases, is in no way the same thing as support from the people. According to a recent poll by Morning Consult, Bernie Sanders has the most support from black primary voters, followed by Joe Biden. Bernie has an overwhelming share of younger black voters, 52% of those aged 18 to 29, while Biden leads amongst older black voters, 44% of those over 65. Bloomberg is in third place when it comes to black support, which is actually quite high when you consider his previous support for stop and frisk and some of the uglier comments he's made regarding race and crime. Speaking of ugly comments, Bloomberg made plenty of troublesome remarks during the South Carolina debate. Here was one I found particularly troublesome.
I have been training for this job since I stepped on the pile that was still smoldering on 9/11.
Gratuitous references to 9/11 were a hallmark of Rudy Giuliani's unsuccessful campaign for the presidency. Trying to score political points from this tragedy was seen by Republican voters to be craven. But at least Giuliani had something to brag about. He actually responded to the crisis in a way that a lot of people found brave or inspiring, and he actually was the mayor at the time. Bloomberg would not become mayor until 2002. Here was another problematic speech for Bloomberg.
Let's just go on the record. They talked about 40 Democrats. 21 of those were people that I spent $100 million to help elect. All of the new Democrats that came in, put Nancy Pelosi in charge, and gave the Congress the ability to control this president, I got them.
You can hear the Freudian slip here, where Bloomberg stops just short of saying that he bought them. Whether or not Bloomberg believes that he owns the politicians whose campaigns he financed. This is the fundamental, systematic problem with American elections that many Democratic, Independent, and Republican voters are disgusted by. Probably the biggest problem with Bloomberg's candidacy is that Americans across the political spectrum do not want their politicians to be bought by special interests, lobbies, corporations, and wealthy people. That corruption is, perhaps ironically, one of the things that helped to get Trump elected, as he railed against what he called the swamp. Well, as a mega donor, Bloomberg has long been part of that swamp. Touting his experience in buying elections is probably not going to improve his favorability for any Americans who don't currently work for the DNC. On policy matters, Bloomberg exposed a lot of his still present Republican leaning. For instance, there was this run criticizing legalization, which sounds like it's from the reefer madness era.
But number three, you should listen to the scientists and the doctors. They say go very slowly. They haven't done enough research, and the evidence so far is worrisome before we get all our kids, particularly kids in their late teens, boys even more than girls, who this may be damaging their brains. Until we know the science, it's just nonsensical to push ahead. But whatever, the cat's out of the bag. So some states have it. You're not going to take it away. Get rid of the decriminalize the possession.
But perhaps Bloomberg's biggest weakness of all was in the arena of foreign affairs. If Bernie Sanders took some heat for accurately pointing to improvements in healthcare and education made by Castro's regime in Cuba, it is unconscionable to think that Bloomberg shouldn't receive backlash for essentially advancing an argument that China has a democracy.
And in terms of whether he's a dictator, he does serve at the behest of the Politburo, of their group of people. But there's no question he has an enormous amount of power.
He not only has a tremendous amount of power, he's also changed rules to allow himself to potentially be president for life. The Politburo, of course, is not a legitimate check on his authority and is not a democratically elected body. As one writer for The Atlantic put it, the flaws in China's political system are obvious. The government doesn't even make a pretense of holding national elections and punishes those who openly call for multi-party rule. The press is heavily censored and the internet is blocked. Top leaders are unconstrained by the rule of law. Even more worrisome, repression has ramped up since Xi Jinping took power in 2012, suggesting that the regime is increasingly worried about its legitimacy. Bloomberg, speaking as if China's government is not so bad, fails to serve both the truth and his campaign. It's not only false to insinuate that China has a fairly democratic system, it's an incredibly unpopular falsehood. Americans may very well want a leader who believes that America needs to work with China, but who wants an American president defending their corrupt political system? America already, in my view, does too much to cater to the fragile ego of China's leaders. For instance, pretending that Taiwan doesn't exist. But pretending that the Politburo is somehow either a serious or legitimate check on Xi Jinping is ridiculous.
I was really amazed at what Mayor Bloomberg just said a moment ago. He said that the Chinese government is responsive to the Politburo. But who the hell is the Politburo responsive to? Who elects the Politburo?
So all in all, despite improving somewhat from his last debate performance, Bloomberg was decidedly the worst contestant at the 10th Democratic debate. As far as winners go, really only Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden qualify clearly, and Biden was probably the top performer overall. His champion performance at the debate was followed days later by a sweeping victory in the South Carolina primary. No doubt his campaign hopes this will bump him enough in the polls to land him in strong contention for Super Tuesday. But as far as that goes, it's Bernie Sanders who still seems to be the best answer to this question.